Welcome to Stump the Priest, a periodic series where people try to stump the priest with questions about the Bible, about the church, about worship, about basically anything they'd like to know that's church related. Today's question comes to us from Kathy Smith. She writes, I had a question regarding Daniel chapter 9, verse 1. There is an Ahasuerus, the father of Darius, a Mede, who is now governing Babylon. I was wondering if this is the same Ahasuerus who chose Esther as his queen, and is this Darius her son? Darius's support for the Israelites' return to Jerusalem made me think perhaps he was showing support for his mother's people. My question is Darius Esther's son? If so, then she and her descendants were very instrumental in the preservation of the house of Israel. Well, Kathy, that's a great question and a really good stumper. I had to do some digging and research to figure this out. Some of it I'd never known and some I had long forgotten. So there's a couple challenges I ran into in answering this question. One is just the confusing nature of names in the Bible, right? We're taking names from Babylon and Persia, and then the writers were transliterating them into the Hebrew Bible or into the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. So there's a multi-faceted language going on, and that means that names get changed. The same person can have different names, and the same name can be used for different people. Lots of names were reused from father to son in these dynasties. And so which person are we actually talking about is one of the challenges for your question. And then the second challenge is the problem of fitting literary works like Daniel and Esther, which were written as literature, as a theology, as, for instance, Esther is really a story that answers the question, why do we celebrate the holiday of Purim? And so let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, there was a queen named Esther, and it goes into the whole wonderful story, which I encourage you to read of Esther. But that's its purpose. It's not trying to give an exhaustive, detailed analysis of Persian imperial history. And so sometimes the writers of these literary works were not as careful as we might like with the actual historical facts. So let's see if we can pick this apart. What's going on with these names? Who is who? And is Darius Esther's son? So we first meet a King Ahasuerus in Ezra chapter 4, verse 6. He's mentioned as king of Persia, the one that Jews sent, the enemies of the Jews, sent representatives opposing the rebuilding of the Temple of Jerusalem. And so he is placed in a series of Persian rulers who are very concerned with the events of Jewish history. Then there's Kathy's chapter, Daniel chapter 9, verse 1, Ahasuerus, who's presented as the father of Darius the Mede, who is said to have become king of Babylon after the death of Belshazzar. But there's an issue with the name here because, and it may be a problem of literary transmission or a misunderstanding of this history. Remember, this was written long after the fact. There's no way to find a name that resembles Ahasuerus, nor any name like Darius in the list of Median kings. So, and it's known that the immediate successor of Belshazzar as the ruler of Babylon was Cyrus the Great, the Persian emperor who came and conquered the Babylonians. So Belshazzar was the last of the Neo-Babylonian kings before the Persians took over. And we'll see a map of the Babylonian Empire, which shows just how vast it was. It really was one of the great, the Persian Empire was just one of the great empires of its time. Didn't last long, but it was huge. And then finally, we have the Ahasuerus of Esther. So who are all these people? Are they the same person, different people? Where it's clear that we can't find the Ahasuerus from Daniel, but there are other Ahasueruses, and we'll see if we can figure out who they are. So let's talk about Esther for a second. Like many books in the Old Testament, Esther is anonymous. We don't know who wrote it. It's possible it was someone like Mordecai who had access to historical documents. Esther takes place in the period after the exile. So this is getting now to the answer to your question, Kathy. Esther is set long after the Babylonian exile, after many of the Judeans were returned to Judah. The story is set in Susa, which is one of the Persian capitals, during the reign of Ahasuerus. Who was he? It's very likely that he was the Persian emperor who was better known by his Greek name, Xerxes I, who reigned from 486 to 464. This was after many Jews had returned to Jerusalem, where they were reorganizing, and that's where the books of Ezra and Nehemiah come in. But there were other Jews still in exile, like Esther and Mordecai, and as a minority group, they were viewed with suspicion and often faced threats, and that's really the context of the story of Esther. So let's take a look at the timeline of Persian rulers and see where these events happen. And so the founder of the Achaemenid dynasty, this Persian emperor, was Cyrus the Great. He's the one who conquered Babylon. That's when Belshazzar was killed. And it was under his reign, Cyrus the Great, that the exiled Judeans were permitted to return to Judah beginning in the year 539 BC. And they happened over time. They didn't all go back at once, but over time they returned. They rebuilt the walls of the city and the temple, and that's the context for Ezra and Nehemiah. His father was named Cambyses, and then confusingly, his son was also named Cambyses, and he reigned from 529 to 522. Then Cyrus's brother briefly reigned, Bardia, whose Greek name was Smerdis. It's possible he was assassinated, very short reign. And then Darius the Great reigned from 521 to 486. It's possible that's the Darius that the writer of Daniel is thinking about, but it doesn't fit the timeline of Daniel at all. So it's a little confusing. And then after Darius the First, we get Xerxes the First, the son, and it is under his reign that the story of Esther takes place. And then they have descendants as well, Artaxerxes and then Xerxes the Second. There's also the question of, because these are literary works, how based were they in reality? And historians are really divided about the historicity of Esther. Some believe, yes, it was based in a true story, but there's no corroborating evidence. It's ancient history. It's not always possible to get corroborating evidence, but there isn't any for Esther. No record of Xerxes marrying a Jewish woman, no record of any of their descendants, no record of the pogrom, of the desire to kill all the Jews in Susa. So certainly could have been true, but there's no corroborating evidence for that. But at any rate, the short answer to your question, Kathy, is no. Darius was not Esther's son, and the Darius mentioned in Daniel is maybe a mistaken name anyway. But I love the idea that there was a connection between Esther and the return of Jews to Jerusalem. It's clear in all these stories, all the biblical stories are interested in the actions of God in history and how God is running that thread of restoration, these times of suffering and exile, followed by this time of return and rejoicing, all of which culminating in the birth of Jesus. So thanks so much for your question. Hope this helped. Probably gave you more than you wanted, but welcome once again, or ask again. Stump the Priest will try again to answer your question.